I would say we're definitely in the middle of a collective psychosis, and from my point of view too, both Obama and McCain are both controlled by the powers that be, by big business. And the one part of me, with Obama, he seems like a more intelligent person and better person and all that. But it might even be worse if he gets elected, because so many people would fall asleep thinking that everything's okay now, where he's clearly just doing bidding. I mean, he's been giving signals from day one that he's doing the bidding of his masters, of the corporatocracy, the, big business powers that be. And so it's important for us to realize that, we're really in it, and the biggest danger that our species is facing is a psychic epidemic, is for millions of us to go collectively mad. And that's what's happening. That's what's been happening for so many years. And the part of the pervasiveness of the collective psychosis is that it's not even being talked about.
Yes.
Because it's just become like, everything appears so normal, and our the whole madness that we're in just seems like a fish in water. We don't even recognize it because it's become normalized.
Yes, it has, and I mean, from a perspective, from a person who views the world in that way, like everything is good, right? We're in progress here. We're doing good, and things are happening and whatnot. What would you kind of say, I guess, to a person like that, to kind of shake them up a little bit? To you better start looking at consciousness here,
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's a tricky thing, because, if we try to convince somebody that they're, have fallen on, into the state of madness, or in sort of they're in denial, in a sense, that's a mad thing to do, because what happens, people become very fixated on, in their particular viewpoint. And like, for example, people who've been supporting, for the last number of years with Bush, we've all had experiences, I can easily imagine, of trying to just, confront them with evidence and with facts, which would snap them out of their whole spell. And yet it's like an impenetrable wall that just protects them from any sort of reflection. And of course, they then feed into other people who have the same sort of, distorted point of view, and then everybody reinforces that particular, kind of like this mad perspective of what's happening. And that's what a collective psychosis is. So it's important for us to have the recognition, what we're dealing with, that, the actual channel that the war is really playing out. Yeah, on one level, there's the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. On some other level, there's the economic war, which is a major thing that is first now coming to consciousness, and that's been one of the key channels that the powers that be are really kind of in an active way perpetuating war. But even deeper is the war on our consciousness itself.
Yes.
And that's really seen when you just study and contemplate people who, in a way, I mean, when you really contemplate with people who are supporting the current system, or just whether they be supporting Bush or McCain, in a sense, they're ultimately feeding their own genocide, and that's a form of madness. And the way to see that, I mean, on like one hand, it's actually unfolding in the greater body politic of the world, but it's actually this reflection of something that's happening inside of us too. Mm-hmm. And that's the way in, because that's where you begin to discover that what's playing out in the seemingly outside, the world, so to speak, is actually this deeper, like an archetypal process that's happening in the collective unconscious of our species. And to see that, so to see the darkness, the evil that's playing out, and it's really important, so many people who are like, kind of interested in metaphysics or spirituality, they kind of, don't really come to terms with the darkness that's playing out from their point of view. Oh, it's not really real. Everything's God and everything's light. And by having that perspective, they're unwittingly being an instrument for the dark. So it's really, really important to come to terms with, in a way, the beast that we're dealing with, that we are having to come to terms with what's called evil. But the key thing about that is that the evil that we're seeing out there, it triggers a corresponding kind of impulse in ourselves. And that's showing us something, that the way to deal with the darkness that is unfolding seemingly out there is by actually getting in touch with the darkness in ourselves, and that empowers us as far as how do we deal with what's playing out, with that darkness that's playing out on the world stage.
So you're saying that we can learn from the bad guys, as it were, right?
Oh, totally. When you see this, in my work, I'm continually contemplating what's playing out as if it's a mass shared, this dream that we're all dreaming up into materialization together. And, when you contemplate what's playing out from that point of view, and of course the language of dreams are symbols, so it's speaking symbolically. Here are these forces that are, just incredibly they're manifesting to transgress our boundaries and to insinuate themselves, into our consciousness or just take away our freedoms. That itself, from the dreaming point of view, is an expression that we're not in touch with our intrinsic power, Right. And the way to understand that is that if somebody had a dream last night and the dream was exactly what's playing out in the world today, and they came to anybody who's good with dreams, it's clear, what's playing out in their dream, i.e. would be the greater body politic, and what's playing out with the Bush administration or with, whatever, just how the whole shadow government that's playing out on the planet. That itself is an expression. It's almost like that's forcing us to develop the muscle of our true intrinsic power. Yes. to actually say no, because people who are really involved in, whether it be with metaphysics, spirituality, they're really into compassion, but compassion isn't like a smiley face thing, where compassion quite often can be fierce. We need to make a distinction between idiot compassion and very like true compassion, which can say no, and which under, the appropriate circumstances will say no and set a boundary. And that's something that we have to do with what's playing out, because time is short. I mean, there's been a coup. There's been this major coup that's just unfolding more and more and becoming evident as each day unfolds. And we have to really come to terms with that, and we just can't continue to be just, let me just meditate and open my heart and then everything will be okay. Yeah, it's really important to meditate and open your heart and to connect with your compassion, but we're also being asked to step into the scene and fully participate as, these what I call political activists who have spiritual wisdom. Because to just be spiritual practitioners and to not be active in the world, or to be just political activists who are just coming from anger, which is actually unwittingly feeding the very anger, feeding the very evil that they're reacting against. Yeah. It's important to synthesize those two, the spiritual and the political.
Oh yeah, I think you hit a key point right there. It's very important because, again, you say all these albeit very well-meaning people, as you say, they come with a lot of energy, but on one level they're still participating in that game, so to speak. They're playing on one or the other side, and the political game is being played in that way that they need an opponent to otherwise there is no game. It's like any football match or what have you,
That is so right on, because we're in the middle. What's happening is like this mythic process that it's an archetypal process that exists in the collective unconscious, and from one point of view, it's very clear that we're going through what's called the end times, in a way, the apocalyptic times. And the word apocalypse, it actually means something hidden is being shown to us, and so there is something. So in the pathology of what's playing out, in the evil of what's playing out, something it's being shown to us. And the key thing is that if enough of us actually have the recognition of what is being shown to us, that is to wake up, that is to have an expansion of consciousness. And what I've been trying to say for, with my whole work, is that as more and more of us connect with that expanded awareness, we're able to activate sort of like this sort of a collective, like this genius that exists in the field. Because you see, what's playing out, it's a field phenomena. The whole thing with the war on consciousness, it's explicating itself through the field of consciousness, which we all partake in.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand, that particular aspect. So if I can go into that for a moment, it would be real important to understand, because you see, the thing is, when somebody like Bush or McCain, Obama, or whoever, when they're actually taken over, in a sense, by their unconscious, they become a conduit for these archetypal forces to give voice to themselves. And because of that, now, like this perfect example would be Bush, because he's been with us for a number of years and we're all so familiar with him. He's been so, in a sense, taken over by his unconscious, by this archetype. And because it's so total, he's, in a sense, one can say he's the incarnation of this process. He's the revelation of this process. And so he's showing us what the process that's actually happening, he's the manifestation of it. So we can understand it by studying somebody who's taken over by it. And the way it works is that when somebody is so disassociated from their own darkness, and then, of course, they project out the shadow, which is a form of lying. It's a form, Jung calls projecting the shadow the lie, and who's the liar mythologically but the devil. So it's really involved with some sort of darker forces. But what happens when somebody, whether it be Bush or McCain or whoever, when they project out the shadow and they then, it's a form of lying to themselves, then they actually become entranced by their own lie, believing their own lie. But because of that, they seem to have a very convincing display, and they develop a certain charisma, because at that point they forfeited being like this human being, and the archetype is actually transmitting itself through them. And that archetype speaks through the collective unconscious, and they can be very charismatic, and they can have an entrancing effect on other people's unconscious. And of course, the whole thing is played out through fear. So it hooks people through their fear. And then, it's like a form of, like, whether it be like with hypnosis or like, just something like that, where all of a sudden people who are following, you see, one way of understanding this very clearly is to see that it's a form of like a virus. It's like it's what I call a psycho-spiritual, like this dis-ease of the soul. And it's like this bug in the system that propagates itself through the unconscious.
Yes. And
until we see that, we're fighting against it, but we're actually unwittingly feeding it, unless we're awake to the way that it actually is, like, kind of propagating itself. And so it's like one way of just to complete this thought is like, say people who don't see what's going on, whether it be with, whoever, with McCain, with Obama, with Bush, and they're actually supporting them and following them, thinking they're like, they're supporting their country and they're doing good in the world. They're unwittingly, in a non-local way, the agents through which that virus is replicating itself through the field. It's a field phenomena, and it needs to be, really contemplated as such.
So could one say that this, as you're describing, is kind of a function of the psyche, or even maybe the collective psyche, or maybe even nature, if we want to go that far, that this is, we're propping it up and we're feeding it, because this actually won't go away until we have properly understood it. So there's a lesson here, so to speak.
Yeah, that is totally it, because we're feeding off of it and we're feeding into it, and so it's like this tapeworm, which gets into a body, but the actual body that it's gotten into is like the consciousness of our species. And, I think of my friend, I don't know if you guys know, I'm sure a lot of your listeners do, Catherine Austin fits. And she's an amazing person that everybody should be studying, because she's so onto what's happening in the whole realm of like with finance and economics. And the metaphor that she's bringing forth is like a tapeworm. And a tapeworm, at a certain point, it gets into your system and it basically puts out chemicals so that you crave what's good for it. So it grows. And then it kills the host. And then when the host dies, it just goes to somebody else. And she says that's what's happening, to the extent that we're investing, like how the real voting is with our money, is with our money. And so how we're investing our money, for example, is, has an enormous effect. And if we're putting our money in the corporatocracy, in feeding the military-industrial complex, we're ultimately feeding the tapeworm, which is supporting and feeding and creating our own genocide. And that's a suicide process. That's a form of madness. And that's what we're acting out on the world stage. Just take a look at what we're doing, where with all the thousands of these nuclear weapons, we're taking down the biosphere, which is the life support system of the planet. And we've all just collectively participated in a financial coup with this $700 billion, the thing with the bailout.
Right.
That's insanity, because the people who we're giving the money to were the very people who created the problem in the first place. And so they're the ones who were profiting from it by us. It's like they've put a gun to our head and are blackmailing us. And all that I'm saying is that, why aren't more and more people talking about that? Because you see, once people kind of like have the awakening to the evil that's playing out, to the deeper process that's playing out, then we're stepping out of being complicit in it, because it can only happen to the extent that we're colluding with it and we're complicit with it.
Yeah.
And of course, what I'm describing is the powers that be's their worst nightmare, is for a sufficient number of people to actually wake up to what they're doing. That's the one thing they don't want.
Indeed. And what does a kind of a leader like that, or an evil system represent, do you think? What is it, in us that brings that forward? You talked about like the archetype of the devil, for instance, or a demon in that sense. But I mean, there must be something that identify, it more identified with an evil system like that.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a perfect question, because what's playing out on the world stage is some expression of something in us. And one way to understand it, it's a great thing to always go back to seeing this as a dream, and what is the dream showing us. And if you contemplate it from that point of view, you discover that these darker forces, in a way, are coming out from hiding in the corners or underground, and they're just showing themselves. An example is the bailout. How much more obvious could it be that we're being held up and just, it's a total criminal act. But from the dreaming point of view, when the darker powers are becoming so clearly evident, that's an expression of that there's light that's just infusing into our world. And so that's a really important thing, because it's very easy to just get entranced into feeling pessimistic and then feeling not connected with our power and feeling helpless. And of course, that just feeds in to the darker forces.
Absolutely. Do you think that all this have come about to begin with because we have neglected the dark side for so long? I've heard, it might be Michael Tessarian who mentioned that the idea that when these darker archetypes, if you will, or even just archetypes, we don't have to put that kind of connotation on them. When we neglect them, they find ways to peer through into our reality, and the more we neglect them, in a way, the stronger they become.
Yeah, that's totally right on. And, the way to understand that, the whole thing with the war on consciousness, it has to do with the psyche, that the origin of the war on consciousness is the psyche. And the way to understand that is to the extent that any one person is not associated with their own shadow, they project it out.
Yeah.
And then, of course, being that this is a dream, if you just think about it in a dream, if you're not connected with your own darkness, you're going to split off from your own darkness, project it out into the dream being just a reflection of your own inner process, because that's what a dream is, just will then send you all the evidence that you need in embodied form of people or events that embody your own shadow. So you're convinced it's really out there because it's seemingly appearing out there, which then just even more kind of reinforces your point of view that the shadow is outside of yourself. And now that's a process that happens. Of course, then we try to destroy the shadow out there, and by doing that, we actually become possessed by the very shadow that we're trying to destroy. And that whole process is a reflection of our inner splitting off from our own darkness. But the thing is, what I've just described in one person, that's happening collectively. That's happening with our species. So that's what I mean when I say the origin of what's playing out on the world stage is in the human psyche. So, and what that means is that for any one of us to actually see our own darkness, so say we see the evil playing out seemingly outside of ourselves, to the extent that any of us have the reflection that the evil we're seeing out there is a reflection.
Paul, are you there? Hello, Paul, can you hear me?
We're having an effect in this in a very real way.
Oh shit, we got disconnected there, I think. Can you hear me? Hello, Henrik here. Can you hear me? Hello, Paul. Can you hear me? Can't hear anything from my end. I don't know if you can hear me or not. Something weird going on here. Okay, let's see here. I'll try to call you back in case you can hear me. I'll hang up and try to call you back. Let's see here. Hello?
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Hello?
Yes. Hello? Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. That was strange, so that we just kind of got cut off.
Yeah, okay. Well, that happens sometimes. I think we'll just lost you when you were describing a little bit more about the dream and how, what we are, that everything we do is reflected, and the dream constantly tells us, basically what.
Right.
Yeah, so maybe if you can pick up from that point and we can continue.
Sure. Should I start now, or?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So the thing I was saying is that to the extent that we see, that what's playing out there and the evil we see being played out on the stage of the world is a reflection of the darkness in ourselves. To the extent we see that and we can embrace that darkness within ourselves, that actually has a real effect on the entire collective unconscious in this local way, which is a physics term having to do with transcending, the typical the laws of space and time. And that's very important because that's basically pointing at that any of us doing our inner work and integrating our shadow or actually seeing the nature of the dream, that's having an enormous impact on the entire world, right out in that moment, both in time and outside of time.
Yes.
And that's a really important thing because you see, one of the dangers is to feel really like I was saying before, not empowered and to feel hopeless and helpless. But we're these amazingly powerful beings. We're these co-creators of what's happening. And what I'm pointing at with my work, when there are enough of us who actually discover that and tap into that and stabilize that, we can hook up with each other. And through that open heart of that expanded awareness, and we can change the waking dream we're having. And that's evolution. And that's not just some sort of woo-woo theory. That's what this is all about. Because being of the nature of a dream, what's happening, it's an instantaneous feedback loop that's continually reflecting back to us everything that we need to know to awaken. And to the extent we see that, That's what makes it so. It's exactly like a dream where it's just our own consciousness kind of manifesting and reflecting back to ourselves. But we become entranced by our own consciousness in a way that imprisons us and makes us feel really separate from each other and just cuts us off from our seeming, the intrinsic God-given power we have to call forth and create reality.
I'm thinking of the concept of lucid dreaming, when you actually become you take control basically of the dream in a little bit, or more correctly would be that you at least become aware that you are dreaming. Right now we're kind of immersed in the illusion, if you will. We're not we don't understand, just as you described, that we actually have the power to change it in that manner, but we have to become aware within the dream in order to actually change it, and do all these wonderful things,
totally. But the thing is, be careful of the idea of people who say to me, "Oh, I've have the recognition that I'm dreaming in my at night, and then I control the dream," because that's an expression that they're not fully awake in the dream. Because who's the I who's controlling? It's not the ego. There's some sort of deeper center that is actually. It's what I call the deeper dreaming self, or the true nature. There are all these words for it, God or Christ or Buddha, whatever. But that's who you actually begin to discover that you are. You're the dreamer of the dream. And simultaneously, you're being dreamed by this deeper dreaming self too. And so that's a perfect metaphor. And one way to understand what I'm trying to point at is that just imagine like one person in a night dream and they have the recognition that they're dreaming. That's one thing. But then imagine in that night dream if they connect with other dream characters who are also beginning to wake up to to the nature of their experience, i.e. that they're in a dream. And imagine, all of this is through the imagination, that all of these dream characters who are awakening in the dream connect with each other and contemplate what they're discovering, i.e. that this world that they're in, being a dream, is nothing other than a function of their own consciousness, which means that it's manifesting in this like really problematic way that's really like imprisoning, because that's the way they've been conditioned to dream it out of fear.
Yes.
And that it's an actual expression of their own state of awareness. And when those dream characters who are awakening in that dream have that realization and put what they're realizing together, it's what I call the sacred power of dreaming. It's the part of us that's dreaming this dream up into materialization moment by moment. When you have enough people in a dream who are able to connect with each other and empower each other's sacred power of dreaming together, they discover, oh, wow, we can change the dream. Now, that's really clear in a night dream. That's empirically, anybody can have that experience. But what I'm saying is that that's the nature of our situation in the waking dream.
Right.
And that's what this is all about. That's what's playing out in the world theater is actually showing us exactly that. Okay?
Right. And, one thing that I'm thinking of here is if this can happen in a smaller scale, so to speak, because again, you're talking about the entire human species here, the collective unconscious of the human species, and that seems like a very daunting task. If you know what I mean, it's more like, does that mean that we have to change, everyone here, or does it matter only what actually I do? Because right now I'm coming from the perspective where I think that, okay, I have to start with myself first. That's the most important thing here, to change my own thinking and approach here in order to maybe at that point begin to influence someone else. But do you think that we can create these small bubbles within the unconscious, if you will, that are more conscious then, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally know what you mean. And one of the big mistakes that a lot of people make is trying to change the collective, where the true change comes through a change in the individual. But as we, each person becomes more awakened and more integrated, they actually have an influence and an effect on the entire field.
Right. And
particularly when we connect with each other. So there's great, there's a metaphor that I use in my book, about when you put, grains of sugar in water, they just dissolve and dissolve until it reaches the saturation point, and then you put one more grain of sugar and then a crystal manifests in that moment. And think of like the collective unconscious as, with any one of us having the realization of whether you want to say of the dreamlike nature or however you want to, sort of say it, any one of us doing that could be that grain of sugar that crystallizes a change in the collective unconscious of our entire species. And so, but the thing is that what you're saying is so important that we have to embody the realization ourselves. And then we actually are able to really, not only through our consciousness, but also then we're able to really kind of have an effect on people out there, in a way that's actually helpful, and instead of trying to convince them of something or having real energy that we're wanting them to get something, which of course then dreams them up to not get it in a feedback loop that I imagine we're all very familiar with, at least I am with that one,
Yes. Very interesting. Now thinking of, the idea also here of how we can achieve, victory, as it were, in the war of consciousness, because again, this is about taking back your own, I don't know if we should call it property or whatever, but this is something that in a way belongs to me, but it has been, as you mentioned with the virus, this has been infected by others through propaganda, through the media, through what have you. So it's very important to begin to take that back and recognize, are my thoughts my own? Is it really me, in here having these desires and wills or what have you? Because so many people seem to be like programmed shells, if you will.
Yeah. And that's the whole idea. That's one of the big dangers of like the whole just like becoming part of the herd. And, as compared to being an autonomous, independent agent, we actually then just get fed into, we like become part of like the collective mentality of unconsciousness, which then we're just reinforcing, on each other. And you see, one of the things that's important to have this realization, I feel, is one of the main things that's keeping everything in place, that's stopping people from having. Okay, one example would be this thing with the bailout. There are so many people who are really, they're turned on to that. It's incredibly criminal, that there's no way it's going to help, that crime that pays is crime that stays. And the idea that we're putting money into an unproductive sector of society, that's totally opposite of anything you study in economics. They always talk about to invest money in productive sectors. So It's clear that what's happening with the bailout is just, it's not going to help. It's criminal, just on and on. But certain people don't see it. And how come that is because it induces a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, of PTSD. It's shocking when you have the realization of the evil and the criminality that's playing out. So because of that, there's a counter incentive to self-reflect, and that actually keeps people from actually going over that edge and having the realization of what's playing out, because it's shocking, for example, to see that the people who are supposed to be protecting us, right? Like we think about the United States government, it's sort of like a father figure. They're supposed to be the ones who are protecting us, that they're the ones we need protection from. To have that realization, that induces a form of trauma, but it's a form of trauma that's actually important to have, because it activates certain creative energies in ourselves, and it begins to actually connect us with our creativity and with our power.
Yes, indeed. I think also the main difference there is that, the first initial trauma is what with the bailout and all this, and we know that shock or trauma is a form of mind control. It creates that schizophrenia basically.
Totally.
But the other thing, of course, is that then the government comes along, as you say, Big Daddy is going to fix everything now, everything is going to be good again. But when we approach that point when we realize that there actually isn't anything like Big Daddy, then the most important step comes along where you have to take responsibility for yourself, and no one else is going to fix this, so to speak, unless yourself taking the responsibility for it. The realization that no one else is in charge except yourself, and as far as I've understood it so far, this can be a very traumatic experience, so much that people refuse to go there, and they look for anyone else to guide them through this process, a leader or the government, what have you,
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And keep in mind, so because what's playing out, I mean, because what you just described is exactly what's playing out, and that from like the point of view of like archetypes or mythology, it's the negative father, the negative patriarchy, which has to do with wanting to dominate and have power over others instead of actually being, having some form of being related to people, as not being separate. And so you see, the thing that's important to understand is that if we got rid of all the people who are playing this out, like Bush and Cheney and even the powers behind the scene, that wouldn't do anything in the ultimate sense, because it's a deeper archetypal process than other people over the course of history would just get dreamed up to pick up those roles and play out those slots. So the point is that there's this deeper and archetypal process in a way whose origin is the psyche of our species that's actually playing out, and it seems to be like, on the one hand, this mythic battle of good versus evil and all that, but the point is that it's something that, that's actually an expression of this deeper process inside the psyche. And when we actually begin to see that, and to see, those darker forces that I'm seemingly that are seemingly out there that I'm fighting against, it's actually like something inside of me. That's actually, then we're becoming like these bodhisattvic agents who are actually who are helping and being agents of change in the world. And that's what this whole thing is about, is for us to begin to wake up to that, to the fact that there is this deeper process that's actually playing out and is destroying us, but is actually some form of it's showing us something that's incredibly important for us to wake up to,
Yes.
I mean, it's so much like in quantum physics. They'll talk about, is the nature of light, is it a wave or a particle?
Yeah.
And then, I imagine we're all, we've heard the experiment where, depending on how you observe it, sometimes it will manifest as a wave, other times as a particle. But the point is, it's how we dream it, it's how we observe it. So is what's playing out just this incredible darkness that's going to destroy our species, and there's going to be like this new world order and fascism? Well, that could potentially be created, but on the other hand, is what's happening also like this real awakening, and like it's like something is being shown to us, like I was saying, apocalypse is something being shown to us, and if we actually see that, then that's what happens, that then more and more of us awaken and connect with each other, and we can literally change the world. And that's the event horizon that we're approaching, and that's actually here. Like, it's not like, this is happening maybe next week or next year. We're in a crisis right now. We really have to wake up and see what's going on, and actually, as participatory agents, to actually step into our power and into our creative genius. And I don't know what that looks like for anybody else. All I can do is just to cultivate that in myself.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. I think in Japan they have the same word for opportunity and danger. It's that idea of with great achievement come great risks. Basically, we have to, as you said in the beginning of the program, we're facing a very difficult period right now, but that also opens up the area of very, I think of that in a very kind of positive light, so to speak. This is something that means that the opportunities for this particular time they're huge. This could actually change the course of how we proceed from after this point in human history, if you will, and that's a very important node, so to speak, in the timeline here.
Yeah. No, that's totally true. And one thing that's important to, I just want to say that for us to develop what's called an imagination for evil, Jung talks about the incredible importance of developing an imagination for evil, because, for example, what's playing out is so over the top, sort of evil or dark, that so many of us, it's off our radar. And we don't even, we don't really fully even see it. And it's so obvious. I mean, think about the bailout. Here, we're being blackmailed to give the criminals this enormous amount of money, but it's so dark and it's so, it's so shocking, and a lot of people just have this, just feeling like, they're just internally in denial. But the point is that until we develop that imagination for evil and actually are able to comprehend the actual, sort of darkness that the people who are playing out the evil roles are actually capable of, until we develop that imagination, we're not going to be able to engage with it in a way where we can actually dispel it. Okay.
Right.
And that's really, and so that's one of the things I think that's really important, that the people who are playing out this, who are the perpetrators, because it's a really cool thing to understand this from the point of view of a family system. And in a family system, there's if there's abuse, there's perpetrators, and then there's people who are like in the role of feeling like they're like the victims.
The victim, yeah.
But an example of like with the bailout is that we're feeling like, oh, we're just the victims of this perpetration of the crime, but we're actually complicit in our own in our own victimization, to the extent that we're not like seeing the actual darkness that's playing out, because it's so like just beyond anything we could even imagine. It's because of that the importance of that imagination for evil that I was just referencing.
Yeah, absolutely, and again, it needs to be emphasized. The financial system has been, it's unstable in its foundations. It's built on fraud and an illusion, and that's why this is coming down at this particular point as well. Although be it that this is all manufactured from behind the scenes, there's no real value, with all the Federal Reserve being not on a gold standard and what have you. We have all of that in the background here, so to speak. But this is a natural, for me at least, from my point of view, this is a natural way that this has to play out. This has to collapse or crumble at some point, until human beings realize that no, this is not the way to go. We need to have a better system and a new system. Of course. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. No, that's totally true. What's happening, I mean, in the realm of economics, and that's why I so recommend people studying the work, like I was mentioning before, Catherine Austin Fitts, because she's been onto this. I mean, she was like the one of the heads of HUD under Bush 1 and the Federal Housing Commissioner, and she really got insight into, the unsustainable, like how unsustainable the economy was and how it was run by criminals, and the incredible corruption that was feeding the financial system. And it was like, she calls it the tapeworm, but it's like this parasite that's just, it's just more and more. It's like a Frankensteinian monster.
Yeah. Because
one way to understand this is in the psyche. When we split off from a part of ourselves, say we split off from our shadow, or there's like a trauma, whatever the trauma is, and we split off from a part of ourselves, that split off part, that develops in a way a seemingly autonomous like will and like this life of its own. Jung calls them autonomous complexes. And it seems to be like this other being inside of our psyche that's other than who we actually are.
Yes.
And the ancients, what they call autonomous complexes, that's what they call, like, with, whether they say devils or demons. It's the same idea. And to the extent that we aren't connected through our consciousness with this split off part of ourselves, it does develop this autonomy, becomes like a parasite, like a virus, like a tapeworm, and it can destroy us. And the thing which is interesting, just to tie this together with like the archetypal, because I keep on talking about there's an archetypal dimension that's explicating itself into our world and unfolding and becoming like evident, is like just etymologically, like the word, like, so the ancients call autonomous complexes, they would say either devil or demon. Well, the word demon, the daimonic, is a word that actually, what it means is the inner voice or the guiding spirit, and it's related to the genius, to finding our calling and hearing a voice and all of those positive things. But if we don't like honor that inner voice, that like that guiding spirit of the daimon, it transforms into something negative and becomes a demon.
Right.
And the thing about the daimonic, it's a transpersonal energy, which means it's beyond just the personal. It's an archetypal energy that when it incarnates, it possesses people. It takes them over, or it possesses groups, or it possesses countries or a species. And then because that happens through the unconscious, think about any one person. When they actually get taken over by their unconscious, they become unwittingly, think of George Bush or John McCain, they unwittingly become an instrument for the daimonic in its demonic aspect, which is always perpetrates destruction because it's acted out unconsciously. So they become an actual instrument or conduit for the daimonic in its negative form to act itself out on the world stage. And that's what's playing out, to the extent that we have so many people who are supporting the current system, who are supporting whoever, McCain or Bush or whatever. They're actually unwittingly being agents of the collective psychosis that's just, continually perpetrating just violence and abuse and destruction, and is actually a suicide process that is potentially taking down our planet, but it's also a wake-up call. So encoded in the pathology, you see, and it's this that's so amazing, encoded in the actual pathology is the solution.
Yes.
It's like it's like showing us that. It's showing us something. It's the same thing within trauma. When you're traumatized, you have the compulsion to recreate the trauma, to repeat the trauma. That's what trauma is. That's the pathology. That's the symptom. That's the problem. But encoded in the repetition compulsion, it's actually is the solution of the very thing.
And we're repeating it in order to understand it better, right? It's like, okay, let me look at this again from another perspective or what have you. This is a way for us to process what the heck has happened to us, to process the trauma, right? To actually begin the healing process.
Right, but the thing is, you see, the thing which is so just, which makes trauma so one of a kind is that the very way we're trying to heal from it is the very thing that's creating the very thing we're trying to heal from in this endless feedback loop that's self-perpetuating in nature. But the point, so we as a species are in trauma. That's very, very clear.
Yeah.
And so we're enacting on the collective stage of the whole, on just like the whole theater of the world, we're enacting as a species the compulsion to recreate the trauma, but yet is that, like you were suggesting, encoded in our acting out the trauma, there's something that we're trying to remember and to access so as to liberate.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the energy that's bound up in that acting out of the trauma becomes freed up for creativity and for love and for constructive activity instead of just to destroy ourselves.
Paul, I think that this is a good place here to run things up for the first segment, and then as we proceed in the next segment in our member section, we're going to tie this in a little bit more with synchronicity. This is another kind of very interesting facet to all of this. How we actually can, get hints, as it were, from the collective unconscious and try to understand things a little bit better on what's going on in the world. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about your book, of course, that is available right now, The Madness of George W. Bush, a reflection of our collective psychosis. That is out. That's available on Amazon. Are you potentially creating a new book? How's that coming along? Would you like to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I've written about, 30-something articles since my book has come out, and it's just, just a deeper kind of contemplation on the nature of the dream, but it's not focused so much on Bush. Like, with my book, he's really the dream character that I'm focusing on to show that we're dreaming and to actually, to really help to wake us up. But so, all I have to do is really kind of put together these articles in the form of a book and to edit them and integrate them, which hopefully will happen soon. And then that'll be my next book, which, hopefully will be out one of these days,
Well, very good. And mention your website again for us so people can check out some of your excellent writing that you have up there.
Thank you. Sure. Yeah. So I have all of my articles. Well, not all of them. I have a ton more that aren't up there that are still in progress. But it's awakeninthedream.com. Be supporting Bush or McCain. In a sense, they're ultimately feeding their own genocide, and that's a form of madness. And the way to see that, on one hand, it's actually unfolding in the greater body politic of the world, but it's actually this reflection of something that's happening inside of us too. And that's the way in, because that's where you begin to discover that what's playing out in the seemingly outside, the world, so to speak, is actually this deeper, like an archetypal process that's happening in the collective unconscious of our species. And to see that, so to see the darkness, the evil that's playing out, and it's really important. So many people who are like, kind of interested in metaphysics or spirituality, they kind of, don't really come to terms with the darkness that's playing out from their point of view. Oh, it's not really real. Everything's God and everything's light. And by having that perspective, they're unwittingly being an instrument for the dark. So it's really, really important to come to terms with, in a way, the beast that we're dealing with, that we are having to come to terms with what's called evil. But the key thing about that is that the evil that we're seeing out there, it triggers a corresponding kind of, impulse in ourselves. And that's showing us something, that the way to deal with the darkness that is unfolding seemingly out there is by actually getting in touch with the darkness in ourselves. And that empowers us as far as how do we deal with what's playing out, with that darkness that's playing out on the world stage.
So you're saying that we can learn from the bad guys, as it were, right?
Oh, totally. When you see this, in my work, I'm continually contemplating what's playing out as if it's a mass shared, this dream that we're all dreaming up into materialization together. And, when you contemplate what's playing out from that point of view, and of course the language of dreams are symbols, so it's speaking symbolic. The whole madness that we're in just seems like a fish in water. We don't even recognize it because it's become normalized.
Yes, it has, and I mean, from a perspective, from a person who views the world in that way, like everything is good, right? We're in progress here. We're doing good, and things are happening and whatnot. What would you kind of say, I guess, to a person like that, to kind of shake them up a little bit? To you better start looking at consciousness here.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's a tricky thing because, if we try to convince somebody that they're, sort of, have fallen on, into the state of madness or in sort of they're in denial, in a sense, that's a mad thing to do, because what happens, people become very fixated on, in their particular viewpoint. And like, for example, people who've been supporting, for the last number of years with Bush, we've all had experiences. I can easily imagine of trying to just, confront them with evidence and with facts, which would snap them out of their whole spell. And yet it's like an impenetrable wall that just I would say we're definitely in the middle of a collective psychosis. And from my point of view too, both Obama and McCain are both controlled by the powers that be, by big business. And, the one part of me, with Obama, he seems like a more intelligent person and better person and all that. But it might even be worse if he gets elected, because so many people would fall asleep thinking that everything's okay now, where he's clearly just doing bidding. I mean, he's been giving signals from day one that he's doing the bidding of his masters, of the corporatocracy, the, big business powers that be. And so it's important for us to realize that, we're really in it, and the biggest danger that our species is facing is a psychic epidemic, is for millions of us to go collectively mad. And that's what's happening. That's what's been happening for so many years. And the part of the pervasiveness of the collective psychosis is that it's not even being talked about, because it's just become like, everything appears so normal, and our hex them from any sort of reflection, and of course they then feed into other people who have the same sort of distorted point of view, and then everybody reinforces that particular kind of like this mad perspective of what's happening, and that's what a collective psychosis is. So it's important for us to have the recognition what we're dealing with, that the actual channel that the war is really playing out. On one level, there's the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. On some other level, there's the economic war, which is a major thing that is first now coming to consciousness, and that's been one of the key channels that the powers that be are really kind of in an active way perpetuating war. But even deeper is the war on our consciousness itself.
Yes.
And that's really seen when you just study and contemplate people who, in a way, I mean, when you really contemplate with people who are supporting the current system or just whether they